Greetings to all the progressive forces in the African continent and in the African diaspora. My name is Floyd Shivambu. I am the president of Africa Mayibuye movement. Welcome to this presentation of Africa Mayibuye movement's political education series, which will form part of the many discussions that we're going to broadcast in different platforms to speak about the politics of Africa Mayibuye movement, but also to speak about the ideological character, the nature, and direction of Africa Mayibuye movement. In this platform, we're also going to make commentary and reflections on some of the developments domestically here in South Africa, in the African continent, but also in the rest of the world, to give a clearer perspective as Mayibuye as to just what is our view and what we think should be done. So today's presentation is going to focus on the frequently asked questions about Africa Mayibuye movement. So this is an information perspective for all members of Africa Mayibuye movement, for all leaders of Africa Mayibuye movement, for all volunteers, for all supporters, but also for everyone who is interested in knowing just what is this organization called Africa Mayibuye movement. So in the frequently asked questions, we're going to respond to the following questions. Number one, we're going to respond to what is Africa Mayibuye movement. And then number two, we're going to respond to the question as to what are the core objectives of Africa Mayibuye movement. The third question that we're going to be responding to will be what distinguishes Africa Mayibuye movement from all other political parties that exist here in South Africa. And then in the fourth question that we're going to respond to will be what are the leadership structures of Africa Mayibuye movement. The fifth question that we're going to respond to is what is the founding story and history of Africa Mayibuye movement. The other question that we're going to be responding to in this series will be what are the core principles and values of Africa Mayibuye movement. And then the next question, the seventh question that we're going to be responding to will be what is the ideological character of Africa Mayibuye movement. The eighth question that we're going to be responding to is what is the vision and mission of Africa Mayibuye movement in terms of South Africa's future. What do we envision should be South Africa's future? And then the next question that we're going to be responding to, the ninth question, will be what is Africa Mayibuye movement's view and perspective on the royal and traditional leadership here in South Africa? The other question that we're going to respond to in this series is what is Africa Mayibuye movement's view and perspective on land reform and land redistribution. And then we're going to then respond on question 11 as to what is the economic policy perspective of Africa Mayibuye movement. And then we're then going to respond as question number 12 to what is the policy of Africa Mayibuye movement on education and development of skills. And then the next question that we're going to be responding to is what is Africa Mayibuye movement's view in relation to religious leadership. And then the next question that we're going to be responding to is what is our broader view on social assistance programs and activities that we must then respond to, in particular in relation to healthcare, social welfare, and a variety of other social assistance programs. And then we're then going to respond to the question of what is Africa Mayibuye movement's view and perspective on migration, in migration into South Africa, because there's a lot of people who have got interest in relation to that. And then we're going to also respond as the last question to how is Africa Mayibuye movement going to create jobs in South Africa. So this is part of the many discussions and reflections which we're going to be responding to. And as I've already stated, we're now going to respond to the primary question of What is Africa Mayibuye movement? What is this organization which we say is Africa Mayibuye movement? So Africa Mayibuye movement is a liberation movement in the 21st century. And to understand that in context is that in the African continent, in response to colonial occupation, in response to the fact that our land, our politics, our culture, everything as our economy, our wealth was taken by external role players, mostly foreign nations, which got to colonize the entirety of the African continent. In response to that, there used to be liberation movements that fought primarily for independence from colonial control and colonial subjugation and oppression. So those were understood as liberation movements that fought for total freedom. Those in context include the African National Congress here in South Africa, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania here in South Africa. It also includes ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. It includes the Southwestern African People's Organization in Namibia, or it's called SWAPO. It also includes Chama Pindudzi in Tanzania. It also includes Frelimo in Mozambique. So those were liberation movements. And in our correct reading, even in hindsight now with even correct observation, is that all these liberation movements were just fighting for political emancipation. They were just fighting for political freedom and independence from colonial control. And they have failed, all of them, to translate that liberation into meaningful, total emancipation and freedom. So we then come in as Africa Mayibuye movement after observing the failures of the liberation movement, particularly here in South Africa, to say we are a movement, a liberation movement in the 21st century that is fighting for total freedom and emancipation now. So what distinguishes us is that we are not limited to just attainment of political power. We are fighting for total freedom and emancipation now. That is the clarion call of Africa Mayibuye movement. And what is this total freedom and emancipation now? We define that in our founding perspective, which is the Africa Mayibuye movement Redistribution Manifesto, to say we are fighting for total political freedom, total social freedom, total economic freedom. We're also fighting to restore and build a progressive developmental state. We're also fighting to build a caring and responsive organization that must deal with the day-to-day challenges of our people. So the totality of the freedom that we're fighting for is in relation to all those aspects, because by all measure and standards, the freedom, or the so-called freedom that was gained by the liberation movements that existed before us, has never been total freedom. It has just been attainment of political independence without attainment of the total freedom. And how do we know that? We know that because all of us in the entire African continent are still under colonial economies, meaning that there is no total economic freedom and emancipation. We're still under cultural subjugation of the colonial masters and cultural domination of the colonial masters, because we have not achieved total cultural freedom and emancipation from the colonial mantle that got to define how we relate with each other, how we relate with our own systems. We have not yet emancipated ourselves from social control of the colonial masters. Our society is still defined by just what the colonialism predetermined. But also, this freedom that was achieved by the former liberation movements, some of which we have mentioned now, has not got to build a progressive developmental state that leads to optimal and maximum development in a manner that inspires confidence, in a manner that resolves the contemporary challenges of unemployment, of poverty, of massive inequalities, of technological development to respond to all the challenges that we're confronted with. but also in the manner in which these liberation movements exist. They are not carrying organizations on the ground. They are just electoral platforms which contest elections with false promises every after a certain period of times. Majority of times it's 5-year terms. They make promises and they do not deliver. They do not get involved in community programs and community battles that get to uplift the lives of our people. So Africa Mayibuye movement exists as an organization that is filling the gap that has existed in the liberation politics of the entire African continent, to say that let us redefine the nature and character of liberation politics and say that in our liberation struggle, in our liberation battle, let us include the fight to achieve total freedom and emancipation now, which we have summarized as the attainment of total political, economic, social freedom, but also attainment of and building of a progressive developmental state. We'll explain what is a progressive developmental state in context, but also to then be a caring organization in that regard. So I think that is basically the summary of what our organization is all about. A progressive developmental state in context, before we move to the core objectives, is basically to have a capable government that is able to drive development and is independent and autonomous from capitalist influences. What that means is that that government must not be controlled by narrow interest of huge business owners, like it's the case currently in South Africa and many other parts of the world, where the interest of domestic and global capitalists determine the content, the agenda, the pace and direction of a government. So we, as Africa Mayibuye movement, we want to build a progressive developmental state that is autonomous from capitalist micromanagement, but also is composed and led by capable leadership, both at political and administrative level, in terms of what happens. And the caring part of our objectives is to say that as an organization, we must be involved on a day-to-day basis with programs that get to empower our people today and not tomorrow, because our people are not poor tomorrow, they are poor today. So as an organization, we play civic roles on a constant basis. So whenever you are a member of Africa Mayibuye movement, you must appreciate that you have joined an organization that must seek solutions every day and now to the challenges that confront your community. So if you exist at the VD level, voting district level, if you exist at the ward level, at the sub-regional level, you must always discuss as to what are the immediate issues that you must respond to collectively as an organization, and then of course as different individuals. So that is basically the summary of what we stand for as an organization and what we are. And of course, because we exist in a political space, we are registered as a political party to, amongst other things, contest elections, because we think that as part of realizing this total freedom which we speak about, we should also contest political power so that we can utilize political power on behalf of the people to bring about the total freedom and emancipation that we are talking about. And in existence, in clear existence, we are not narrowly a political party, we are a movement, because we have got far much wider and broader objectives. A political party component of our movement is just for electoral purposes, which is aimed to at taking political power on behalf of the people, not on behalf of ourselves, on behalf of the people, so that we can drive thoroughgoing transformation of society in its totality in terms of what happens. But also there are multiple manifestations of our organizations that give it the movement character, meaning that we exist also as a women's movement that champions the interest of women. We exist also as a youth movement that champions the interest of young people. We also exist as a student movement that champions the interest of students. We also exist as a workers' movement that champions the interest of workers against super exploitation. We exist as a community organizations, as a civic organizations, as an organization that deals with day-to-day interests and aspirations of our people. So in summary, that is the character of Africa Mayibuye movement. Now, we are responding to question number 2. Question number 2 is, what then are the core objectives of Africa Mayibuye movement? Objective number 1 is equal redistribution of land to all the people of South Africa. We come from the perspective that land ownership in South Africa still reflect the colonial patterns, meaning that the colonial settlers, which in South Africa is the white minority, continue to own and control majority of the land here in South Africa. So we are fighting for the equal distribution of land in South Africa in a manner that will reflect the demographics of South Africa. So land ownership in South Africa must reflect the demographics of South Africa. So if Africans are 80% of the South African population, they must own 80% of South Africa's land. And that is all land for agricultural purposes, for residential purposes, for industrial purposes, for religious purposes. That land must be available for all the people of South Africa on an equal basis, because the freedom that we have, the so-called freedom that we have now, has not given back the land. So that is a primary core objective of Africa Mayibuye movement. The other core objective of Africa Mayibuye movement is equal distribution of all the natural resources and wealth. South Africa is possibly one of the wealthiest countries in the entire world in relation to the mineral resources, both industrial and precious minerals and metals. We are the richest. We have got more than 50 different minerals and metals here in South Africa, but they are not for the benefit of the people of South Africa. They do not have, our people here in South Africa do not have access to the massive reserves of platinum group metals, of gold, of coal, of all these minerals that are strategic for energy, for technology, for communications, for a variety of other purposes. So as Mayibuye, we fight for the equal access to all the mineral resources and wealth here in the continent, including the oceans, meaning that we must make the oceans available to the people of South Africa for fishing purposes and a variety of other useful economic activities. And part of the approaches that we advocate for as Mayibuye is to say that access to mineral resources must not be a sole preserve of multinational large corporations. There has to be a systematic and systemic guidance of small-scale participants in the mineral resources sector. So, of course, outside of the zamazamas and all of those things, there has to be guided access to small-scale mining in South Africa, which must be empowered. There must be small-scale miners who extract gold, who are able to process chrome, who are able to process all the mineral resources that come from beneath our soil. The other objective, the core objective of Africa Mayibuye movement is full industrialization and the ability to produce goods and services and products domestically, for domestic consumption, but also for global consumption. The importance of industrialization is that we move from a perspective that there is no country in the entire world, maybe except some of the few countries in the Gulf states which depend on the oil riches, that have ever got to realize full prosperity without undergoing thoroughgoing industrial expansion. So South Africa since 1994 has been somehow deindustrializing, and that is demonstrated amongst other things by the closure of factories and different firms that were even established by the racist and murderous apartheid regime in the areas that were demarcated as homelands. So industry in terms of manufacturing in South Africa has been dying down. And the situation that we are in now is that we import almost everything. Almost all consumer goods and products that we have in South Africa are coming or are made outside of South Africa. What that means is that we are creating wealth and jobs for many people outside of South Africa. We bring almost everything, inclusive of food. We bring almost all the textile and clothing material here in South Africa. Almost all clothes that we are wearing here in South Africa, all of us, are made outside of South Africa. Almost all shoes that we wear here in South Africa are made outside of South Africa. Almost all electronic products, phones, television sets, household electronics like microwaves, fridges, and all of those are made outside of South Africa. Almost all automobiles, like the vehicles, the cars, they are made outside of South Africa. The trains are made out of South Africa. There is, of course, some paltry, minimal attempts to assemble motor vehicles here in South Africa, but we do not manufacture any motor vehicles in South Africa. So as Africa Mayibuye movement, we advocate for, and we have got a clear plan on how we should drive massive industrialization here in South Africa. It's part of our core objectives as to just what do we want to do with the strategic control of the natural resources to which we say should be given access to all the people of South Africa. Our other core objective is to realize a full and holistic decolonial free education and training for all the people of South Africa. What does that mean? It means that we should provide free education, that there must not be fees for education from early childhood development up until attainment of postgraduate degrees. So like endlessly, there must never be fees for education. But one is that education must be decolonial, and also it must be an education that is empowering. We're going to speak in detail as to what do we mean by empowering education system that produces skilled people who will add value to our communities. And the other objective that we have as Africa Mayibuye movement is full employment and jobs for all the people who need jobs. When we call for full employment, we know that the natural and economic resources, the strategic location of South Africa with a coastline which spans more than 3,000 kilometers, we have the possible and practical possibility to create jobs for all the people of South Africa who need jobs. So that becomes part of our objectives. And we specifically say in our Restoration Manifesto that the jobs that we are going to create are not going to be limited to people who are below the age of 35. The jobs are going to be available for everyone who wants to work. Even if you are 60 years old and you want to work, under a Mayibuye-led society and government, you will be given an opportunity to work. That is part of our core objectives as Africa Mayibuye movement. Full employment in a manner that is sustainable, and not these temporary jobs that government brags about in the current setup. The other core objective of Africa Mayibuye movement is agrarian reform to guarantee food security and development of the food economy value chain. In any society, the food economy is possibly one of the largest part of the economy, because in a population of 63 million, every day each and every individual must have some food intake. And the entire food chain, in terms of economic terms, comes from agriculture, from actually manufacturing of seeds and seedlings. land, agriculture, the tractors that are utilized to farm and cultivate the land. It includes the processing of food, the packaging of food, the retail of food. There is a huge economic potential that can be derived out of the food sector. As Mayibuye, we advocate for agrarian reform which will specifically empower small-scale farmers. Small-scale farmers, so that as many people as possible here in South Africa should be able to involve themselves in food production and empower their families, empower their communities, empower the local state, empower provincial governments, and make sure that they have got sustainable livelihoods. And we're going to utilize state power and state procurement to make sure that all small-scale agricultural participants and practitioners benefit out of agriculture. So all small-scale farmers will benefit from being involved in agriculture under a Mayibuye government. What that means is that the food which government buys for basic government functions must be bought from local farmers. The food that government buys for school feeding schemes, for hospitals, for prisons, for everything else must be bought from small-scale agriculture. And that is going to empower a lot of our people in a sustainable basis, because the demand for food will never end in terms of what is required. The other objective is full investment and utilization of technology and advanced systems to realize sustainable development and progress. So as Africa Mayibuye movement, we say let us utilize technology optimally in all sectors, from agriculture to education to management of government systems, in a way that is going to empower our people. There's a lot of technological advancements in agriculture which we can give access to our people so that they can be able to have much more efficient and clear agricultural production, whether it's stock production or crop production, in a way that is much more sustainable. We should utilize that and pursue that as Africa Mayibuye movement. But also we must utilize technology optimally to educate our children and give them access to technological education systems which will make the children of South Africa at par with the advanced nations in the world. But also we should streamline and make sure that there is technological usage optimally in all government systems. Currently, government systems are disjointed. There is no common system that speaks to each other, from Home Affairs to the South African Social Security Agency, to the South African Police Service, to the revenue collector. So each and every department collects information separately, which is not integrated. As Mayibuye will integrate information so that we know how we utilize that much more optimally. So the usage of technology will also involve the usage of technology for safety and security purposes domestically. Will also involve the usage of technology for the defense of our country in terms of military defense, optimal usage of technological advancement. So that constitutes part of our core objectives as Africa Mayibuye movement. Part of the objectives of Africa Mayibuye movement, why we exist, is we want to reintegrate royal and traditional leadership into systems of government, because part of the colonial destruction was to destroy the institution of traditional and royal leadership here in South Africa. If anyone believes that there is recognized royal and traditional leadership in South Africa, they are basically daydreaming, because the current constitutional framework and foundation does not recognize the role of traditional leadership in allocation of resources at the local level, in allocation of land. Even the institutions that appear to be legitimating or legitimizing traditional leadership primarily belong to government, inclusive of the Ingonyama Trust. At the ultimate end is the Minister of Government who is responsible for Ingonyama Trust. all other traditional authorities do not have any defined legislative powers to allocate resources, even in response to areas where they come from. So as Africa Mayibuye movement, we want to reintegrate or integrate fully the traditional and royal leadership into systems of government so that they can have a say in the allocation of resources, in the allocation of land, in the allocation of strategic interventions that respond to the communities where they come from. And of course, such will be done consistent with the rules and principles of gender equality, such that females are not excluded from allocation of land. That will be done as well on a process and principle of transparency and consistency, so that certain pieces of land are not given to same individuals who end up fighting because there was no proper allocation. But as Africa Mayibuye movement, we set as our core objective the mission to integrate traditional and royal leadership into the system of government, because currently they are being treated as tokens or as symbols that do not have any say in the allocation of resources. Now, the next major question that we are responding to is what distinguishes Africa Mayibuye movement from all other political parties. Number one is that Africa Mayibuye movement is founded by the people of South Africa. We do not flinch, and we do not even have second thoughts when we articulate the fact that it was founded by the people of South Africa. Before Africa Mayibuye movement was founded, we conducted thoroughgoing and intense consultation process to ask the people of South Africa objectively to say what is to be done. And then they are the people, it's the people on the ground and through different social media and official media platforms who gave input to say this should be the character and nature of Africa Mayibuye movement. In the Restoration Manifesto, which establishes the organization, we basically transcribe all the issues that were raised by the people of South Africa. There's more than 100 reasons which the people of South Africa gave as to why a new movement is necessary for here in South Africa to exist. And the clarity that came from the inputs of the people was that Africa Mayibuye movement must not just be an electoral platform like all the existing political parties, but must be a movement that responds to the interest and aspirations of our people. So the major distinguishing factor is that we are an organization that is founded by the people of South Africa. There is no any other organization that exists in South Africa today that can say it was founded by the people of South Africa. Majority, if not all, of these organizations were founded by individuals for different purposes and for different reasons. But Mayibuye was founded by the people of South Africa. That is why it is a people's organization. But two, Africa Mayibuye movement exists as an organization that seeks to resolve the problems and challenges of our communities today and not tomorrow. So we are not an organization that is just going to come with electoral promises and say that we will only be able to respond to your problems once we are government. That is why in our existence as an organization, we exist already with a component of our organization referred to as Mayibuye Medics, which is a combination of healthcare practitioners, medical doctors, nurses, professional nurses, and some of the practitioners who practically go to our communities and provide free quality health care to our people and people who otherwise would not gain access to quality health care anywhere in South Africa. We also have a law clinic that provides free legal interventions to all the people who otherwise will never gain access to a lawyer, because there are so many people who get to be abused by large institutions, by employers, without any legal protection. But also as Mayibuye movement, we are different from all these other organizations in that we are the only organizations that truly recognize the role of royal and traditional leadership. The rest of the organizations, they just use them as tokens and they use them as symbols. They do not have any clearly defined role as to what should they do and what role they should play moving forward. The other distinguishing factor of Africa Mayibuye movement is we respect religious leaders and religious institutions. We do not think of them as platforms to campaign for elections. We think from time to time our branches at a ward level, at VD level, our leadership structures and institutions and fraternal organizations at municipal level, at district level, at provincial level, should always seek constant guidance from spiritual leaders of whatever faith that they believe in or whatever faith that exists. We do so because of the appreciation that majority of the people of South Africa belong to one or another faith institution. You cannot be able to truly represent the people of South Africa if you do not get guidance consistently from religious and faith leaders in our communities. And the most important distinguishing factor of Africa Mayibuye movement is the very fact that we are a people's movement. And what does that mean? Is that every mandate, every decision, every action that we take as an organization is guided by the interest and aspirations of the people. There are organizations, if not all, that exist in South Africa, particularly in Parliament, whose mandate come from big businesses, from the capitalists, from the bourgeoisie, from the so-called investors, to the extent that if they are dealing with the land question, the primary interest that they're looking into is what are the businessmen going to say about this? They don't care what the people are going to say about it. Whatever decision that they have to take, their major worry and concern is what are the businessmen or the so-called investors going to say about this. In every solution which they try to provide, they always ask a question as to how do they eat and how do they get to benefit out of that. But in Mayibuye, everything else that we do, every action that we involve ourselves in, is for the people of South Africa. It's about the interest and aspirations and cries and battles and grievances of our people. We respond to the interest of our people. So we are a people's organization that is grounded in our communities. So that is basically what distinguishes Mayibuye from all these other organizations. And while we participate in elections, that is not the primary reason for our existence as an organization. So there are organizations that exist just to contest political power. Ourselves, we exist because we want to respond to the cries and problems and challenges of our people in South Africa. And elections is just but another platform to fight for that. We are not just existing to contest elections. We are an organization that exists to resolve the poverty crisis, the suffering crisis, the cultural domination crisis, the social domination crisis that define particularly the black majority and Africans here in South Africa. And if elections constitute part of resolving that problems, we will participate from time to time in elections, but that is not our primary purpose as a movement. So that is a distinguishing factor of Africa Mayibuye movement. So everyone else who is a member of Mayibuye must know that if they are not responding to the challenges of the people every day, they do not understand, they have not yet internalized the values and principles of Africa Mayibuye movement. The next question, which is the fourth question that we are responding to, is what currently are the leadership structures of Africa Mayibuye movement? So Africa Mayibuye movement's basic unit is a branch A branch is organized alongside voting districts. In South Africa currently, we have 23,192 voting districts. So in each and every voting district, and majority, if not actually not majority, all the voting districts are represented by a voting station. So that is a very important unit to speak about, because it means that in each and every village, in each and every section of a township, in each and every informal settlement, there will be a basic unit of Africa Mayibuye movement that addresses the challenges and concerns of the people. So that is the most basic unit of our organization, a VD-based branch of Africa Mayibuye movement, and it is led by a leadership that must be elected by the membership of that particular VD, and then the leadership is referred to as a voting district core team, which leads the programs of Africa Mayibuye movement at a voting district level. And that is a very important thing. And then, of course, the second layer of structures of Africa Mayibuye movement is as per the Municipal Demarcation Board's demarcation of wards. But wards are not the most perfect instruments of organization, particularly if your objective is developmental and upliftment as that of Africa Mayibuye movement. So ward-based structures are for purposes of electoral purposes. And we will, of course, constitute ward-based branches as Africa Mayibuye movement, which are demarcated by the municipal demarcation boards. In South Africa, currently, we have got 4,488 wards. And then the branch leadership of a ward is referred to as the branch core team, or BCT. And just to clarify what constitutes the composition of a VD-based branch. So for a VD-based branch to be launched, it must have a minimum of 50 members. And then it must elect leadership, which is referred to as the VD core team, VDCT. And at a ward-based level, the BCT must be elected by a membership which must be minimum of 200 members in each and every branch. And then in the next layer of leadership in Mayibuye is a sub-regional core team which leads at the demarcation of municipalities. So in South Africa, we have got 205 municipalities and we have got 53 districts, which includes the metropolitan districts. So the districts refers, in the case of Limpopo, to Vembe district, which has got municipalities of Musina, Collins Chabani, Makado, and Tulamela. It refers to Skukune district, which has got the municipalities of Elias Mtsaledi, of Ephraim Mukhale, Makudu Tamaga, and Fetahomu Tubat. It refers to the district of Capricorn in Limpopo, which has got the local municipalities of Mulemole, of Blueberg, of Lipelenkumpi, and Polokwane. It refers to the district of Mopani, which has got the local municipalities of Greater Tanin, Papalabura, Greater Giyani, Greater Litaba, and Maruling local municipalities. It refers to the district of Waterberg, which has got the local municipalities of Mudimule, Mokopong, Tabazimbi, Bela, and Mukhalakwen. So that is basically the demarcation. I'm just using the component and the illustration of Limpopo, but in Gauteng, the district will refer to Tshwane, will refer to Ekurhuleni, will refer to Johannesburg, Sidibeng, and Western. In the case of KwaZulu-Natal, it will refer to the district of Mkhanyakude, it will refer to the district of Ilembe, of Ugu, the district of Amajuba, the district of Mzinyati, the district of Mngungundlovu, the metropolitan of eThekwini, which is a district as well, the district of King Tetwayo, and it will also refer to the district of Ugu. So those are the districts which must have their own leadership structures. So there's sub-regional core teams that lead municipalities at local level. At district level is regional core teams that lead each and every district so that there is proper coordination of the work that they respond to. At provincial level, in the provinces that are demarcated, the 9 provinces, we have provincial core teams that are leading Africa Mayibuye movement at a provincial level. And at the national level, the highest decision-making structure is the national core team of Africa Mayibuye movement. And we have got a national working committee which is referred to as a Politburo. So a Politburo is a term that refers to a political bureau. So the Communist Party of China is, the working committee there is referred to as the Politburo. The Communist Party of Cuba, the leadership working committee there is referred to as a Politburo. Frelimo Party in Mozambique, which is a liberation movement, its working committee is referred to as a Politburo. So we have adopted that term. The Communist Party of Vietnam, its working committee is referred to as a Politburo. So we have adopted that to have a working committee which is a Politburo of Africa Mayibuye movement. But also we have got another leadership layer of Africa Mayibuye movement which is called the Council of Elders. The Council of Elders is elders, which is mostly senior traditional leadership and religious leaders who give us constant guidance on some of the pending questions that we must respond to. But we also have a chaplaincy. So a chaplaincy is a religious component of the organization that give chaplaincy work, spiritual guidance, and every time like attend to issues that relate to spirituality in the entire organization. So those are the structures of Africa Mayibuye movement. And we can speak now without doubt that the leadership structures of Africa Mayibuye movement exists in all the provinces. And we've got leadership structures in all the districts. And we've got leadership structures in majority of the sub-regions at the municipal level. And we are in the process now, as of March 2026, of building ward-based and VD-based branches, which are going to be the primary instruments of development and of pursuit of the agenda for total emancipation and freedom now. So that is basically where we are. And as of March 2026, the composition of the national officials who are forming part of the Politburo is, the president is myself, Nico Floyd Shivambu, and the first deputy president is Comrade Tato Wamahohodi from the Northwest Province. The second deputy president is Comrade Nomsa Kamashobani Sibisi. The third deputy president is Comrade Spepile Cyprian Mahlaba from KwaZulu-Natal. Even the second deputy president is from KwaZulu-Natal as well. The third deputy president is Spepile Cyprian Mahlaba from KwaZulu-Natal. He is also the chairperson of KwaZulu-Natal province. The Secretary General is Comrade Lazola Ndamase, is originally from the Eastern Cape. The first Deputy Secretary General is Mzwandile Goge, is from KwaZulu-Natal province. The second DSG is Nosipo Makamba from the Western Cape province. The national chairperson is Comrade Mabato Mukause from the Northern Cape province. The deputy national chairperson is Comrade Sipiwe Mkhatshwa from Mpumalanga province. The national organizer is Comrade Patrick Sindani from the Free State province. And the Treasurer General is Comrade Tsepo Mahanuke from Mpumalanga province. And then the Fundraiser General is Comrade Menzi Magubane from KwaZulu-Natal province. And then the Chaplain General is Archbishop Bafana Stephen Zondo from Gauteng province. So that is the current officials of the leadership. And then the other responsibilities in the Politburo has got different responsibilities, which includes heads of communication, of political education and publications, which includes heads of mobilization, which includes also the presidents of the youth, the students, and the women's movement. That is basically the current leadership structures of Africa Mayibuye movement. And the process of appointment of leadership structures is conducted through a process we refer to as deliberative democracy, meaning that the names are recommended for those that have to lead at different levels of leadership, and we discuss their capacity and the availability and a variety of other components that are necessary to consider before we assign them leadership responsibilities. So that is applicable for sub-regional, regional, provincial, and national leadership. But at branch level, which is ward-based and VD-based, the leadership structures, they are elected through open, transparent elections where the membership vote for who they prefer to be leadership. It's not appointment through deliberative process that apply to all other levels of leadership. The next question that we have to respond to is, what is the ideological character of Africa Mayibuye movement? The ideological character of Africa Mayibuye movement appreciates scientific socialism, but has got full appreciation of the South African circumstances. Here in the Restoration Manifesto, we say that in our application of scientific socialism, we should take into cognizance, into full recognition, multiple dynamics that define South Africa. One is a society whose population is still led by royal and traditional leadership, and that we must never disregard in our application of scientific socialism. We must never disregard the traditional and royal leadership. And two, in our application of scientific socialism, we must have full appreciation of a very large religious community here in South Africa, and that we must not be disregarding the religious leadership and religious institutions here in South Africa, that we must have full recognition of all the religious institutions. That in our application of scientific socialism, we fully recognize and acknowledge the leadership and guidance of all the important and all the self-respecting and honest religious institutions, inclusive of the Zion Christian Church, of the Nazareth Baptist Church, of the 12 Apostle Church in Christ, 12 Apostle Church in Trinity, of the International Pentecostal Holiness Church, of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, of the Catholic Church, of the Apostolic Faith Mission, of the Assemblies of God, of all the church denominations, and of the Muslim community, of the Hindu community, of those who believe in African indigenous faith systems. We fully acknowledge their role. We never ever delegitimize their relevance. And this point is very important to highlight, because there have been in history those who, in the process of applying scientific socialism, viewed religious streams as enemy forces or as forces that are opposed to scientific socialism. Our scientific socialism is not opposed to any religious streams. We believe, in fact, that these can be mutually reinforcing. Scientific socialism and whatever religious belief that does not distract society, that does not preach individualism, that does not preach greed, that does not preach corruption, that does not preach wrongdoing. So that is the perspective that we are moving from as Africa Mayibuye movement. So our character as a scientific socialist movement, which also embraces progressive Pan-Africanism, it means that we are anti-imperialist in character and form. What that means in action is that we do not associate with countries that occupy other countries for narrow purposes. We do not associate with countries that start wars in other countries. We do not associate with countries that continue to super exploit the natural resources of other countries. We do not associate with neocolonialism. We always associate with progressive countries and forces in the world. In the contemporary politics of the world, we associate with the People's Republic of China. We associate with the Russian Federation. We associate with Brazil. We associate with India. We associate with countries that are not involved in colonialism. We associate with countries that are organized in the BRICS Plus component. We also associate with progressive nations in the African continent and in the African diaspora. We defend the people of Cuba's right to full sovereignty. We oppose the embargo that has been imposed on the people of Cuba for more than 50 years. So that is what also drives our scientific socialism, because we should be internationalist in character. We should appreciate that in pursuit of our struggles, we must appreciate that there is other struggles that are happening in the world, and our struggles are connected to the battles of other parts of the world. But we have got full appreciation of the domestic dynamics and conditions that we have outlined as to how do we apply our scientific socialism in South Africa in a much more clear and decisive way. Now we're going to talk to the principles of Africa Mayibuye movement, the core principles and values of Africa Mayibuye movement. Principle number one is collective leadership, that we always take collective decisions. So we do not have the problem of presidentialism in Africa Mayibuye movement. So there is no president or chairperson of Mayibuye who can take individual decisions outside of the collective. So everything else that we communicate in Mayibuye is a product of the collective decisions. So there is no super leader of Mayibuye who speaks outside of the collective mandate of the organization. So collective leadership is the core and guiding principle of our organization. We always give example and guidance to leadership structures at provincial level, at regional level, that when you are a chairperson of a province, the deputy chairperson of the province is not your deputy. The secretary of the province is not your secretary. It's the secretary of the province. That is to reinforce the principle of collective leadership. Including myself as a president now, the secretary general of the organization is not my secretary. Even the deputy presidents of the organizations are not my deputies. They are deputy presidents of the organization, because we respect the principle of collective leadership. The other principle which guide our movement is the principle and value of democratic centralism. The democratic centralism principle basically means that decisions of upper structures are binding on lower structures. That basically explains that we are a unitary organization. We are not a federal organization. Once we have taken decisions centrally through democratic engagements, they are binding on all structures of the organizations. And once decisions have been taken, the right to differ dwindles into insignificance. It doesn't matter what you believed before we push collective perspective. This is to avoid a situation where the national leadership will give guidance to the entire organization and a province communicates something different or a region communicates something different. We speak with one voice, multiple voices, one message. That is the principle that we safeguard. And democratic centralism is the glue that holds the organization together. The other principle that guides our organization is respect for all people. That we must respect everyone, including members of different political parties. We do not use insulting language in Africa Mayibuye movement. We do not undermine anyone irrespective of their social standing in society. We do not treat people differently because they are poor or rich. We treat people equally. That is a principle that guides all of us and should guide all of us as members of Africa Mayibuye movement. The other principle is the principle of honesty, the principle of tell no lies and claim no easy victories. Everything else that we do must be honest. That also includes an obligation amongst all members and leaders of Africa Mayibuye movement that they must own up to everything else that they do in private. So honesty also means that everything else that you do and say in private as a leader of Africa Mayibuye movement, you must be able to fully own up in public. That is the principle that guides all our leaders in our organization. The other principle is the principle of utmost and optimal discipline, meaning that we should always work in a disciplined way, must be punctual for meetings, we must adhere to the principles of the organizations in totality. We must always show unwavering commitment to organizational goals and perspectives. That is what guides us. The other principle is a principle of selflessness, meaning that all of us who are in Africa Mayibuye movement are not in the organization for self-enrichment purposes. That if you view Mayibuye as an instrument for self-enrichment and self-promotion, you are in a wrong organization. Our organization is defined by selflessness, meaning that we sacrifice everything for the sake of the people of South Africa, for the sake of the people whose agenda we're fighting on behalf of. The other principle of Africa Mayibuye movement is love for the people and love for one another. So love is a very important component that is mentioned in the Restoration Manifesto of Africa Mayibuye movement, to say let us love one another. And coincidentally, the love that we speak about is mentioned in almost all religious texts. It's a foundation of almost all religions, be it Islam, be it Hindi, be it Christianity. In Christianity, it's centered as the center of everything. It's the summary of everything else that is spoken about. And love is not just a feeling, it's actions of kindness, of patience, it's action of understanding other people, of not undermining people, of not having evil intentions. So that is part of the principles that guide all of us as members and leaders of Africa Mayibuye movement. The other principle is the principle of knowledgeability. Knowledgeability means that we must know the areas where we exist in. We must know the circumstances and conditions of our people. You will not be able to provide any viable solutions to your communities if you do not know anything. You will perish if you do not have knowledge. So knowledge is important. And that includes basic knowledge of just where you are. If you are a leader of Mayibuye at a ward level, you must know everything about your ward. If you are a leader at a sub-regional level, you must know everything about your municipality. And you must also have superior alternatives as to just what do you do different to what all these other political role players are doing in the areas where you exist in. The other principle that guides Africa Mayibuye movement is class consciousness, is the awareness. Consciousness means awareness, that you must be aware of the class that you are representing. And the class that we represent as Africa Mayibuye movement is the people, which is those who do not own big businesses, is the propertyless class, the working class, or they call the proletariat in some other language. So that is what we must always be aware as leaders and members of Africa Mayibuye movement, to say whose class interest are we in pursuit of in every decision and action that we take as an organization. The other very important principle is a principle of consultation and seeking constant guidance. That before you take decisions, leaders of Africa Mayibuye movement must always consult with members, must always consult with communities. They must not come and superimpose their positions on the people. They must always be guided by the sentiment of the people. You must not think that they are some superhuman beings and super ideologues over the entirety of society. The next question that we have to respond to is, what is Africa Mayibuye movement's position on immigration and so-called open borders? Here in the Restoration Manifesto, which is the founding document and perspective of Africa Mayibuye movement, we categorically state, we clearly and without any contradiction state that Africa Mayibuye movement opposes undocumented immigration and open borders. That Africa Mayibuye movement advocates for criminalization of employers of undocumented immigrants, and also advocates for proper security vetting and making sure that there are certain sectors of South Africa's economy that must be preserved for the people of South Africa. That is our position. But that does not place us in opposition to Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism means that the entire African continent should integrate in terms of infrastructure so that we can promote intra-African trade. Currently, the African infrastructure is such that the railways all lead to the ocean for the exportation of our natural resources. The Pan-Africanism that we advocate for is for the common prosperity of the African continent. So there are certain aspects that have to be dealt with different in terms of enhancing and harnessing intra-African trade, and that is the position that we stand for. We fully associate with the progressive Pan-Africanism of Kwame Nkrumah, of Julius Nyerere, of Sokoto, of Emperor Haile Selassie. So our opposition to undocumented immigration does not make us to be anti-Pan-Africanist in character and form and in terms of the policies that we have to then focus on. So we as Africa Mayibuye movement do not promote illegal immigration into South Africa, but we are not opposed to any form of Pan-Africanism. Now, comrades, we want to now clarify as to what then becomes the summarized vision of Africa Mayibuye movement, that we envisage South Africa as a fully and a totally liberated sovereign nation with total freedom and shared prosperity and dignity and no exploitation at all. We envision South Africa as a country with highly developed productive forces, meaning that the economy should have grown optimally. There must be industry in all corners of South Africa. There must be full development of agriculture, of all economic sectors, in a way that is competitive here domestically, continentally, in the entire African continent, and globally. We envision a South Africa that is able to produce all its goods and services for domestic consumption and for the global and continental consumption as well. We envision a South Africa that must be able to build industries that must produce everything, including electronic products and cars and vehicles and aeroplanes and ships and everything. That is the kind of South Africa that we envision, that South Africa must be part of the highly industrialized nations, and that must be done within the appreciation that the continent must achieve collective prosperity. That is basically what our movement stands for. So that is basically our vision, and we're unequivocal about that, because the manner in which liberation movements before us have been envisioning our country has been to position ourselves as exporters, as efficient exporters of raw and semi-processed goods and products. We do not want that. We want to achieve full local beneficiation, create full employment, defeat poverty, and have an economy that is sustainable for future generations and for forever in the manner that it is. Now, the next question that we have to respond to is, what is our perspective on royal and traditional leadership? We mentioned it in the core objectives, that in South Africa currently, there is no full recognition of traditional and royal leadership. That is why even in the Constitution, there's only one sentence that mentions royal and traditional leadership, and it's not any sphere of governance and government in South Africa. And the reason why traditional and royal leadership is not recognized in the South African democratic setup is because the liberation movement, or the former liberation movement, the ANC, which was the primary negotiator in the CODESA negotiations for a democratic South Africa, had wrongfully characterized the entirety of royal and hereditary leadership as part of enemy forces. So in their characterization of hereditary leadership in South Africa, and largely due to the Bantu stance and largely due to the fact that apartheid had tampered with the institution of traditional leadership, so the ANC, which was the major protagonist in the negotiation process, went into government with the intention of destroying the entire institution and juniorize it into permanent insignificance. That is why in all legislations, there is no clearly defined rule for the institution of royal and traditional leadership. That is why traditional leadership does not have any role in the distribution of land. You can go to many court records, high courts and constitutional court. Every time traditional leadership tried to allocate land or against municipalities, against a provincial government or national government, mostly in urban spaces, the courts will always rule in favor of governments because there are no clearly defined rules of traditional leadership in the allocation of resources. And that is due to the ANC's earlier mischaracterization of the position of traditional leadership. Of course, there were elements, very few and minority, of traditional or royal institutions that were co-opted to advance the apartheid system and agenda. But the majority of our traditional leadership were pro-liberation. Majority of our traditional and royal leaders wanted total freedom for the people of South Africa. They wanted to remove poverty for our people. But the current liberation movement, or the former liberation movement, I mean to say, never got to recognize the important role that the institution of royal leadership plays. And in our recognition of traditional and royal leadership, we also say as Africa Mayibuye movement that the current demarcation of wards is extremely problematic. Because if you go to rural areas, the municipal demarcation board groups 5, 10, sometimes villages, or 3 villages, and then call them one ward. And in some instances, they will even group different traditional and royal leadership under one ward and say, this chief and that chief and that chief and that chief is one ward, but there is one councillor who is a representative of all those chiefs. And in all the cases, the councillors are made to be above the traditional leadership, which is fundamentally problematic. There has to be recognition of each and every settlement, each and every village, each and every locality in South Africa. And that can only be realized if there's a proper and clear working relationship with the traditional leadership. But also, the benefit of traditional authorities and leadership from their mineral resources must not be a function of negotiation, must not be a function of business dealings like the Royal Bafokeng would do in the Northwest Province. It must be automatic that if there is mineral resources that are discovered in the land that is under traditional leadership, the traditional leadership must automatically benefit, and significant benefit. There are so many areas in South Africa and Sekhukhune. There are so many areas here in South Africa in the Northwest Province, in Bapong, Bamogale too, in many other areas where there is multi-billion rands worth of mineral resources extraction by multinational companies. But the traditional leadership, they are living in absolute poverty, in abject poverty. So in our advocating for the recognition of traditional leadership, we also advocate for the recognition of traditional leadership in terms of meaningful royalty benefits from the minerals that are found in the traditional communities. And there are so many here in South Africa, including in the Northwest and many parts of KwaZulu-Natal. There's a mine in KwaZulu-Natal called Richards Bay Mineral, which has been extracting strategic minerals, rare earth minerals, and has been excluding the communities of Mbonambi, of Sokulu, and a variety of other traditional authorities from benefit. So there has to be foundationally in the legislative process the inclusion of traditional leadership in the benefit system of South Africa, so that it's properly recognized institution in a much more sustainable basis. We have spoken already about the next question on land redistribution, on just how do we get to handle the land redistribution, that land must be equally shared to all the people who belong to South Africa in a manner that reflects the demographics of South Africa, and those that get to be involved in agriculture must be given agricultural support, and the state must provide strategic assistance through provision of permanent off-take agreements of all the agricultural products that will be produced by small-scale farmers at all levels. And in terms of our economic policy blueprint and our economic policy position, is that the state should play a strategic role in the ownership and control of strategic sectors of the economy. But the state will not be the exclusive owner of strategic sectors of the economy and control. There will be a role of other role players in the strategic sectors of the economy. There will be a role of cooperatives, there will be a role of private sector participation in certain sectors of the economy in a way that is developmental, in a way that is guided by legislation, in a way that is guided by policies that emphasize local beneficiation. You know, in South Africa, like, despite the weaknesses of the many systems that came before the so-called democracy, we give example of huge and highly successful cooperatives. There's a cooperative in the Free State Province. It also exists in Limpopo and Northwest, called VKB, which has got a turnover of more than 10 billion rands annually. And it's owned by more than 5,000 cooperative shareholders. It's involved in agriculture. It's responsible for a substantial production of maize meal, which is staple food for majority of inland population of South Africa. And that is basically what we're looking into, that the strategic sectors of the economy should be owned and controlled by the state, but there should be other role players in the ownership and control of the economy, and that there must be massive industrialization domestically of the economy, and that there must be integration of the African economy in a way that is much more sustainable, and that the state should utilize its procurement power to drive industrialization and to drive agriculture. What that means is that all the motor vehicles, the government garage has got millions of motor vehicles. All the motor vehicles that the state utilizes must be made in South Africa fully, not assembled in South Africa. All the textile that South Africa buys as a government, for police officers, for nurses, for schools, for everywhere, must be made here in South Africa, so that we can be able to generate much more meaningful economic activity in a sustainable way. So our view about the economic policy outlook is that we must utilize the fiscal policy, which is the budgeting process, to drive local industrial expansion. Same with monetary policy, which is about the value of the currency must be adapted for local beneficiation and industrialization in a manner that is much more sustainable. Then what is our view, the question that we have to respond to in terms of skills development and education in South Africa? Despite excluding a significant number of the people in South Africa, the post-secondary education and training system and space is not empowering our people in a much more developmental way. Our view and perspective as Africa Mayibuye movement is that the schooling system from secondary level, from standard 6, grade 8, must begin to empower our people with practical skills. It must not matter whatever theory you're studying. When you exit matric, there must be some set of skills that each and every South African who has been to school is able to have. There must be some degree of practical capacity that each and every person who has gone to school is able to do. And we say that this should include the following: carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, sewing and tailoring, nutrition management, basic accounting and bookkeeping, public speaking and effective communication, problem solving skills, coding and programming of technological products, web development, because these are contemporary issues that we must then be able to deal with, graphic designs, marketing, cybersecurity, data analysis and interpretation, robotics and automation, 3D printing and modeling, renewable energy technologies. So all those sets of skills must be mainstreamed into our secondary education, even later on continued at TVET level, universities of technology and universities, so that we have got a society that is wholly skilled. As we stand, it's highly possible in South Africa that you can struggle to find a plumber in a township with more than 20,000 black residents. You can struggle to find an electrician in villages with thousands of residents. But there are people who have been to school. So there has to be a method of changing our education system to produce skilled people who are able to perform one function or another. The other question that we have to respond to is, what is our view on religious leadership? We have already emphasized that we as Africa Mayibuye movement have got full respect of religious and faith leaders of whatever faith denomination. We've got full respect of all religious institutions and leaders, as long as they are not involved in wrongdoing, as long as they are not involved in things that are harmful to society. And we as Africa Mayibuye movement do not agree with governmental regulation of religious institutions. We do not agree specifically with the current process of the CRL process, which is chaired by individuals who seem opposed to particularly the Christian faith. So we do not associate with that as Africa Mayibuye movement. We believe that religious leaders and religious institutions play an important role in the upliftment of our communities, in the upliftment of our people. The other question that we have to respond to is on healthcare. That our perspective on healthcare is that despite healthcare being universal and accessible to all the people of South Africa, the primary focus and philosophy of healthcare in South Africa must be focusing on primary healthcare. Primary healthcare referring to preventive healthcare system and knowledge system. That healthcare departments, inclusive of clinics and hospitals, before people approach them with diseases and sicknesses, those institutions should have gone to the communities to preach health awareness, to teach our people about the different health profiles and diseases that exist in our communities. Majority of our people are not aware of the so many diseases that are avoidable and which can be prevented, because government is not running a public education system on healthcare awareness. That is why in Africa Mayibuye movement, even before we are government, part of what Mayibuye Medics does and will always do is community health awareness, is public health awareness on a variety of diseases, of what is diabetes, what causes diabetes and how to prevent it, what causes hypertension or high blood pressure and how to prevent it. And that is the kind of empowerment which Mayibuye will be preaching through the existing media platforms, social media, but also through practically talking to all the people that have to be spoken to. The other important aspect that we have to respond to is on social assistance. That in Mayibuye, all the structures have social assistance, the head of social assistance as part of the officials. But all the meetings of Mayibuye must have social assistance programs as part of the standing items of the agenda of the meeting. So, you know, in all other organizations, they've got chairpersons, deputy chairpersons, secretary, deputy secretary, treasurer. In Mayibuye, we have those positions, but we also have the head of social assistance, who must come and coordinate programs, must come with and coordinate programs of what does the branch do to respond to the community problems and challenges. What do we do with safety and security in our schools? What do we do with basic infrastructure in schools that we can repair without having to spend a lot of money? What do we do with the water crisis? What do we do with our environment, where some areas can be cleaned in a much more better way without any reliance on any government? A branch of Mayibuye must always know how many people are living in households which are led by children or by the elderly who are unable to perform certain functions. So a branch of Mayibuye must always be involved in activities and programs that assist our people every day, where practically possible must establish early childhood development centers, must be able to establish healthcare centers for primary healthcare awareness and screening of our people with just what diseases they are confronted with on a constant on a constant basis. So that is basically our view in relation to how healthcare should be attended to. And we as Africa Mayibuye movement will always be involved in all these programs, even before we are government, even post-government. That will be a primary focus of how we look after the healthcare of our people. The most important issue, of course, that we have to respond to, and as a last issue, is the issue of jobs and job creation in South Africa. We have to speak about that because more than 40% of the people of South Africa who are of working age are able to work, do not have jobs. We've got a crisis of unemployment and therefore poverty and starvation in South Africa. And we have to confront unemployment much more practically. All existing political parties do not have any ambition, do not have the will, do not have the plan to abolish unemployment in South Africa. If you do not believe what we are saying, go and read the manifestos of all the existing political parties for this current term of office. There is not a single political party that has got an ambition to create more than 2 million jobs. This is despite the fact that there is more than 12 million people in South Africa who are jobless. So Mayibuye has got a much more comprehensive plan. We have spoken to it when we emphasize the nature and character of our economy. That at the center of job creation in South Africa will be the expansion, one, of small-scale agriculture and participation. That let us give land parcels to our people and guarantee the offtake. We will be able to take as many people as possible out of poverty. So small-scale agriculture will be able to resolve the poverty question in rural areas. You do not need huge plots or parts of land or plots of land to generate respectable income from agriculture. Particularly the category of crops that are referred to as cash crops: cabbages, potatoes, carrots, sweet potatoes, spinach, lettuce, all of those things. If we have a system of clear offtake and empowerment of our people, we will be able to resolve the jobs crisis, because a lot of our people will be involved in small-scale agriculture that is properly supported in a sustainable way. So number one, in terms of job creation, is agriculture. Number two is industry. We need to build industry. We must manufacture our own goods and products. Industry will be a solution to the massive job crisis that confronts society. And these industries must be built where our people stay. It must not be normal that for you to work in a factory, you have to go to Johannesburg, to Durban or Cape Town or Port Elizabeth. We must build industries where our people stay. There was a program before. Those who lived in the past know that in almost all the homelands, in Ciskei, in Transkei, in Gazankulu, in Kwandebele, in Venda, in Bophuthatswana, in Kangwane, in all the areas, in KwaZulu, there were so many industrial centers that existed amongst the people which were producing meaningful goods and products. We have to push our industries and factories to the areas where our people stay. And the most powerful instrument of taking industries to where our people stay is industrial subsidies, which government must put in place. It does not make sense in the current policy framework of industrialization that subsidies are given to special economic zones that are in areas which already had industries before. There is no need to impose certain taxes in industries that must go to where our people stay. So there is a scope here in South Africa to could create millions of jobs from agriculture, from industry, and also from an efficient and effective public service. And how do you then build an efficient and effective public service? We necessarily must abolish all the tenders. There are so many functions which the state is obliged to perform on a daily basis, but has outsourced to private role players. And in a drive to make as much profits and as much money as possible, the private role players, even those who get tenders of government, they go and employ undocumented migrants so that they can pay them very little salaries, and then they accumulate the rest as profits for themselves. But if we have internal state capacity to clean roads, for refuse removal, to perform all the state functions, everyone else who is going to be employed will necessarily have to be a person who is from here in South Africa. That is going to resolve the job crisis, the jobs crisis that define our community. And these are the things that we talk about and have got clear plan on. But also the other important aspect is to support the small and medium enterprises that emerge in different communities of our people that wants to be involved in meaningful participation. And we already spoke in terms of our policy on how the mineral sector must be processed. We must train our people in Sekhukhune and Rustenburg in the Northern Cape, in KwaZulu-Natal, to be involved in the extraction of our mineral resources, in the extraction and beneficiation of our mineral resources. It cannot be the sole preserve of the multinational companies to extract our mineral resources. Our people must be involved in small-scale mining and supported with the necessary infrastructure, with even a scope to grow to become huge corporations, and with even a scope to could export whatever mineral resources that they produce in a sustainable way. In that way, we would have structurally reconfigured South Africa's economy from what it is now, because currently South Africa's economy is a neo-colonial economy that produces raw and semi-processed goods and products for exportation and imports almost all goods and services and products that are finished and are manufactured outside of South Africa. So we need to pursue a progressive agenda as Africa Mayibuye movement. And thank you very much. We have come to the end of this first session of Africa Mayibuye movement. We are going to provide the link in all these videos of where people who want to participate in Mayibuye must begin to participate and form part of this otherwise very revolutionary and noble agenda and program to attain total freedom and emancipation now. That is the agenda that